how do you see monetary policy playing out in the next few months or so? Of course, obviously, we had that ambitious growth target of 5% announced at NPC. Is monetary going to be key to delivering that, you think, Zhu Ning?
I think it's definitely an important ingredient of all the policy boxes that we're going to have coming out of the Chinese government. But I don't think the monetary policy will be taking the front seat in setting the pace for either the economic growth or for helping with the stabilization of the financial sector. I think the NDRC apparently is taking more and more of the dominant role in setting, industrial policy, in setting the major tones of economic policies these days.
I was going to ask you about the balance sheet of the central bank. They added 5 trillion yuan of assets recently, which is the quickest build-up we've seen in a decade. How much do you think this sort of expansion could actually lift growth in China?
It certainly helps. I think just like what the Western central banks have been doing over COVID, I think an accommodative or more easing attitudes towards the monetary policy is not only providing the much needed liquidity to the economy, but also improving the expectation of the overall environment. I think, but the one thing we have to keep in mind is, I think the monetary multiplier, so to speak. So how much the money that the central bank has put into the system is really going to generate additional demand or additional usage of its base. So I think in the past, real estate has been a very important sort of multiplier in the developers will get the money and take the loan, buy the land, and then use the land as a collateral and then make another round of investment. But with the weakening of the real estate sector, or actually the pretty much inactivity in the real estate sector, I think that one has to discount to a certain extent how much that 5 trillion will eventually be helpful in generating the total demand or aggregate demand.
Some people will look at a number like that and they're saying, oh, this looks like a Western style QE. Can we call it that?
I think that the PBOC would rather you not call it that, but I think in essence, we really do not have a lot of new ideas out of modern monetary theory or the monetary theory in general. So in a way, when you're facing a slowdown in the economy, more accommodating monetary policy is necessary. So whether it is taking the form of interest rate cut or in the form of just generating a bigger balance sheet, I think that is just the choice of different possibilities in the toolbox.
And you mentioned about the property sector woes and the like. How important do you think consumption is going to be for the economy this year versus previous years? And what are your expectations on the lift that consumption could have on the economy for 2024?
Well, I think it's critical. I have been saying this for a long time. I think consumption will have to be the only driving force to lift China from the high middle income class country to a high income country. So in a way that I think consumption is really not only important, but also probably the only driving force for China going in the coming decades. And this year, I think, there are a couple of brighter spots and there are some uncertainties. For the bright spots, we can see that the foot traffic is really improving. So I think that is showing increasing economic activities. And also we're seeing that, things are stabilizing and people are having far more visibility with, what is the new norm going to look like? So I think that's going to be helpful somewhat. The downside is I think we're also seeing that people are traveling more, but then they're actually per capita or per trip spending less. So I think this is somewhat consistent with my observation. I think the younger generation, unlike the previous generation who need certain kind of stimulation to consume, they're already quite active with their consumption. And the fact that we're seeing they're slowing down their consumption or not growing their consumption is largely because I think they're really reaching the point of their income or disposable income. So I think that in the end, the growth in disposable income is eventually going to be the determining factor for how consumption is going to shape up in the coming years.
Yeah, that's a good point that you think the young are still quite active when it comes to spending. But why do you think household savings are so sticky? That is it just a concept of Chinese people are frugal in some ways, and is cash handouts, as some have really debated about, is that going to be the answer to really getting people to spend again?
I mean, I do a lot of research in behavioral finance in which we really study people's fear and greed. And I think it's really the fear. I mean, first of all, the fear from COVID or the aftermath of that, and then the fear of the uncertainty in the economic environment. And I think in the previous year or so, the fear in the falling housing prices and the falling stock prices, which really don't, I mean, make the households wonder where can they put their money without having to suffer a loss. Hence, they are willing to put more and more money into the safest option that they can think of, which is the savings account.
Okay. Good point there. I'm just wondering, in terms of what we heard from the MPC, there's been a big push when it comes to industrial policy, right? New productive forces and the like. I'm just wondering, just given what we've been seeing, hold on a second. We have some breaking news, Zhu Ning. We are watching that PBOC one-year MLF rate. So, okay, unchanged at 2.5%. So this is basically what people were expecting. But they are withdrawing a net 94 billion RMB through that MLF. All right, let's move on. I'm going to get to Zhu Ning a little bit more on this, what we were just talking about, which is about new productive forces, industrial policy. It's interesting, though, that we continue to hear this sort of aggressive push towards high-tech manufacturing, innovation, the like. But we're facing quite a bit of overcapacity, right? And tensions with the U.S., with Europe as well. Do you think that policymakers need to sort of adjust their industrial policy to address some of these concerns out there?
Well, I think instead of adjusting, I think the policymakers are actually doubling down on the industrial policy in a way that we're seeing some kind of industrial policy coming out of the U.S. or Europe. So that's giving some confidence or justification for China is thinking even harder on how to utilize the industrial policy to better itself in the competition in key technologies. So I think that's probably one key message coming out of the two sessions this year about, I think China is actually continuing, if not increasing its emphasis on the industrial policy and the so-called new quality productive forces.
Yeah, I'm just wondering in terms of what we just heard from this MLF, right? So it's unchanged. They refrain from a net cash injection for the first time since November 2022. What do you think are some of the reasons driving this? Is there really a concern about the currency in some ways, as well as what we've been seeing when it comes to banks and their margins if we continue to see more rate cuts in the pipeline? Are those sort of big factors that the PBOC and policymakers are really thinking about now?
Yeah, I think I've been commenting on this for some time. I think that the PBOC is somewhat in a delicate balance. On one hand, it needs to be more accommodative with the economy, but on the other hand, it has to be very watchful with how the foreign exchange rate goes. I think it's giving the PBOC some breathing room or some sweet spot in the next few months with the Fed plan to cut interest rate. I think that's going to give China's central bank a greater room to maneuver in the next few months. So I think it's going to be more active in playing this balancing game between growth and stabilization of the RMB exchange rate.